Oh, joining us now, MS Now national security analyst, retired Navy Admiral John Kirby. He's also a former Pentagon press secretary, among the many hats he has worn. Admiral, now that CENTCOM has this third aircraft carrier in the region, apparently aiding with the blockade, what capabilities or options does it open up? And should we read into this movement happening during the ceasefire?
Yeah, that's a lot of combat power that aircraft carrier will bring, because she's not just going by herself. She'll have escort ships with her. So a lot of helicopters, a lot of tactical aircraft, a lot of firepower that they could use if they have to do more boardings or stop ships in a more violent, aggressive way than they have been. So this makes now 3 aircraft carriers they have in the region, because the Ford is still over in the Red Sea area, or the Eastern Med, and now you got the Lincoln and the Bush. So that's an awful lot of credible combat power that the U.S. Navy, the Central Command Commander, has at his disposal.
What about the impact of the Pentagon shuffling out the Navy secretary at a time when naval operations have become central to this war, with the whole world focused now on this one narrow waterway? Is that concerning?
I don't think it's helpful, but I also don't want to overstate it, Anna. The Secretary of the Navy is mostly responsible for the manning, training, and equipping of the Navy, the purchasing of new ships and new capabilities. You do have an undersecretary that has been told to step in as acting. I have no doubt that the U.S. Navy will continue to be able to provide this kind of combat power and these kinds of capabilities to the fight with or without Mr. Phelan. And look, every cabinet official, every political appointee serves at the pleasure of the president. And if you lose his trust or confidence for whatever reason, it's time to go, and you should go. And so I want to give the president some latitude here to make these kinds of decisions on his own. I am more concerned about 2 things. One is the level of churn in the Pentagon. Mr. Hegseth just keeps burning through officials, not just political appointees like Mr. Phelan, but mostly, in fact, generals and admirals who have spent a lifetime in uniform and absolutely are important to the fight here. And so I'm concerned about this personnel churn at the Pentagon, which is, to me, extremely worrisome. The other thing that concerns me is the readiness capabilities of all these forces you have in the Middle East. Now, the Bush coming in fresh, that's good. But the Ford, that aircraft carrier, has been on deployment now for 10 plus months. Those ships, those sailors, they're tired and they need to get home for a refit. The other readiness capabilities that you have in the region have been now stationed there for, going on 6 weeks plus. And now they're in a ceasefire, so they're not really operating. And so their readiness will continue to decline over time. And that should be a concern, I think, as well.
You've stood at the Pentagon press podium many times. I want to highlight some of the striking moments from today's presser with Secretary Hegseth just this morning. Let's watch.
We are not counting on Europe, but they need the Strait of Hormuz much more than we do, and might want to start doing less talking and having less fancy conferences in Europe and get in a boat. This is much more their fight than ours. I would call it a silly conference in Europe last week, where they got together and talking about maybe doing something eventually.
Admiral, the Secretary has used these briefings as a platform to trash talk allies, as we just heard, in addition to Iran, and to berate media coverage of the war, even to deliver religious propaganda. As someone who has stood at that podium, what do his appearances during this war accomplish?
They don't accomplish much of anything. I really wish that I'm glad to see that the Secretary and General Kane are doing briefings. I think that's important. I wish they had more traditional media in there, or were taking questions from actual media outlets and not right-wing influencers. And I wish that they would tone down the rhetoric and start to answer legitimate questions in a thoughtful, respectful way. And on to the allies. I was in Europe last week, and I had a chance to meet with some senior officers from different NATO nations, and I also met with some officials in France at the Ministry of Defense. And I can tell you, they take very seriously their obligations to the NATO alliance. They take very seriously the role of American American leadership in the alliance and around the world, and they don't want to see it diminished. And they're really grappling with what the options are ahead of them. They do take the Strait of Hormuz seriously. They did have that meeting, and it wasn't some silly conference. They're really trying to wrap their hands around what they can do to alleviate the pressure around the Strait of Hormuz. And it's not an easy question for them. They weren't consulted. They had no idea this war was going to be fought. And they don't have a stake in the conflict with Iran. And so to berate them at the same time, you ignored them and didn't even try to consider their views or the effect on their national security, I think is a gross injustice to foreign policy.
There is very much an us against the world narrative that we're hearing from that Pentagon podium. And the Wall Street Journal is reporting that the U.S. has now burned through so many munitions in Iran that some administration officials are increasingly assessing that America couldn't fully execute contingency plans to defend Taiwan from a Chinese invasion if it occurred in the near term, U.S. officials said. What's stopping China from exploiting that?
Well, first of all, there's the issue of the munitions, and I read some analysis that in some cases we're down to half our stockpiles of major missile systems like interceptors, and maybe about half of our Tomahawk cruise missiles. That's dangerous because we have global responsibilities. It's not just in the Indo-Pacific. We have responsibilities around the world to ourselves and to our allies, and so I hope that they're dealing with these stockpile issues with some sense of alacrity and energy because it's serious. As for what China will do with Taiwan, I don't see a scenario where China will look at this and say, well, the United States has half its munitions, so we're going to go ahead and attack Taiwan. I don't see that in the offing. I do think, though, that President Xi is watching very closely what the United States military is doing in the Middle East. And on one hand, he has to be impressed. I mean, it is truly, from a tactical perspective, an amazing performance by our military. On the other hand, I suspect that him and the People's Liberation Army are not all that upset about the fact that the United States is now embroiled in another war in the Middle East and therefore unable, either in terms of munitions or in just focus, to continue to focus on the Indo-Pacific and the challenges that China continues to pose, not just to Taiwan, but to countries in the South China Sea and to some of our other treaty allies. So that we are focused elsewhere, I'm sure President Xi is grateful for that.
John Kirby, thank you so much for taking the time this morning.